One night in 1936, London's famed Crystal Palace went up in flames. The orange glow of the fire could be seen for miles around. People came to watch. No one knew how to stop it. So the gathered crowd stood and watched the tower of flames roaring until dawn broke. Maybe the country considered it a warning. The destruction of the palace, which had been a great monument to affluent Victorian Britain, complacent in their lives and homes, unaware of the changes the coming decade would bring. One night in 1936, the fragile peace that had been bartered following the Great War and global economic depression shattered.
Ethiopia is firmly for peace.
We heard the sounds of gunfire in distant lands of Egypt, Ethiopia, and nearer in Franco's Spain. The Treaty of Versailles contravened as Nazi Germany's military re-enters the Rhineland. The sounds of war would creep ever closer to our shores as the decade drew to its close. New regimes of communism and fascism promising us a glimpse of a better future. We were hopeful then that these regimes would usher in a new modern age. Decades later, we see the events of 1936 as a chilling prelude to what was to come at the end of the decade. Another war so great it would kill millions and displace millions more. One night in 1936, a burgeoning crisis would reach its crescendo, shaking Britain and countries across the Commonwealth. One king dead. One king exiled. One king reigned. This was a time of great instability for the English royal family, calling into question the role and relevance of the monarchy in a rapidly changing world. This was 1936, the year of 3 kings. Celebrations were in full swing, bringing in the new year.
New York City greets the end of 1935 with an unprecedented turnout of whooping, howling joymakers. Times Square seems to be the rendezvous for millions of celebrants, eager to welcome 1936 in a way that hasn't been equaled in 20 years, if ever.
It was an exciting time to be alive. Innovations in transport and technology throughout the world. Dams and bridges were built, and economies recovered from economic and political crises.
Of the greatest dam in the world.
Jazz clubs. Olympic Games. Airships. Clark Gable and Greta Garbo on the big screen. The invention of radar, Polaroid photography, and canned beer. The monarchy was popular. King George V had celebrated his Silver Jubilee in the spring of 1935, and the country came out in force to demonstrate their affection and allegiance for him. Crowned king upon the death of his father Edward VII in 1910, King George V believed in his duty to his role and country above all else.
Well, George V was very different to his father, Edward VII, because he was a much more traditional figure. He was somebody who was much more interested in maintaining the integrity of the monarchy.
George V was a very good king in the sense that everything that was integral to his being was about responsibility and duty and dignity.
He was a king who had to move with the times. He did so by presenting himself as a figure of duty, who took his responsibilities as king very seriously, who put the nation ahead of his own desires.
King George V and Queen Mary had 6 children, Princess Mary and Princes Edward, Albert, Henry, George and John. Though he came to power in a time of peace, that period of détente was to be short-lived, as in 1914, the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand heralded the beginning of the First World War.
Clarion call to arms, the country eagerly responded. Everywhere the nation's manhood flocked to the army in answer to Kitchener's demand for 100,000 recruits.
During this conflict, his eldest sons, Princes Edward and Albert, would serve in the Navy. George made the decision in 1917 to found the House of Windsor, adopting the British name Windsor in lieu of the German Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, in an attempt to distance the royal family from their Germanic lineage and appear to the public as more British in the wake of the anti-German sentiment during the First World War.
He wasn't a dynamic figure. I mean, he's often been called the most boring king ever to have ruled England. But he was the right person at the right time, because obviously what England needed at that moment was somebody who was boring and was stable and wasn't going to run off with chorus girls like Edward VII did.
The country, the people, felt very safe with their monarch. And so we could say he was a diligent, dutiful king. While we can say that George V was definitely a good king, we cannot say that he was a good father.
He was quite an old-fashioned figure. He was very much a Victorian.
Children should be seen, even rarely, and not heard.
The king had a fraught relationship with his children, especially with his eldest sons, Edward and Albert.
Of his 4 sons, the 2 eldest, later Edward VIII and George VI, had a very difficult relationship with him because he was this cold figure and his wife Mary was cold as well. And it was very much a sense that everyone was brought up in a way to understand duty, and the idea of duty as the central tenet of what you were suspected to do as a royal prince, something that he laboured home intensively.
Frida Dudley Ward said of Edward that he had always said that he hated his father and his father was horrible to him, and while he loved his mother wouldn't let him love her, and that she always sided with the king.
And if we look at it now, we'd almost regard it as abusive, because we look at the idea that these children were being treated in ways that were not humane and were not kind. But on the other hand, back then, there was no concept of kindness as we understand it today.
You could never blame Edward for his problems because he had had such a terrible time at the hands of his parents.
In 1911, the king invested his eldest son Edward with the title of Prince of Wales, making him next in line to the throne.
I think that Edward becoming Prince of Wales in July 1911 was actually one of those things which spelled disaster both for him personally and possibly for the institution of the monarchy, because he never wanted the responsibilities that came first of all with being Prince of Wales and secondly with king. But set against this, Edward always had a very great interest in prestige, in money, in the trappings of monarchy. So you could argue that in fact when he became Prince of Wales, though symbolically it was disastrous, on a practical level he was now being given all of his various sovereign grants. So he had, for the first time in his life, the ability to spend the money that he wanted to spend largely on himself, but also on whichever woman had caught his eye to be his latest mistress.
Towards the end of his life, the relationship between the king and his eldest son and heir Edward began to splinter.
So unlike his father, Edward loved the modern world. He loved cars, American automobiles, he loved jazz clubs, he loved nightclubs. He was good looking, he was charismatic, he was dashing. The people adored him.
Driven by change, interested in new things. He saw the 20th century as this great opportunity, and in that respect, very different from what had come before.
I think it's fair to say that Prince Edward hated his father. I think it's fair to say that he despised him for being this anachronistic, stuffy figure, and that he absolutely despised the idea that his father had been pushing him into this unsuitable garment, if you like, and that the garment of monarchy did not fit very well with him. He was a man who preferred dressing up in Savile Row suits to ceremonial robes. So I think that his loathing of his father was something that stayed with him all his life.
He really tried his best within the constraints of his character to honour the position of his role, and he was incredibly popular. I mean, he was a celebrity. He was actually very like Diana in that sense, that the people adored him, the establishment thought otherwise.
Everything about his character was entirely unsuited to the role of a monarchy. But this could be seen even as a young man, because from his university days at Magdalen College, Oxford onwards, he was somebody who escaped from this rather chafing boundary that he found himself under, because his parents had essentially told him all of his young life, you are going to be this dutiful prince, you are going to be king, you are going to do this, you're going to do that. By the time that Edward was of age, he had a simple answer to this: no, I'm not.
The king is famed to have said, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months. And of his second son Albert and granddaughter Elizabeth, I pray to God my eldest son will never marry and have children, and that nothing will come between Bertie and Lilibet and the throne." Prince Albert had been more similar to the king, who shared a sense of duty, though many royal historians have attributed Bertie's stammer on the fear that the young prince harboured about his father during his early years.
He was reserved, he was anxious, he was shy, he was dutiful, the complete opposite of his brother Edward.
As a young Prince of Wales, Edward proved to be one of the most popular members of the royal family amongst his people. He had served during the Great War, albeit far away from the front lines, and was seen as accessible and fashionable as he took extensive tours of the Commonwealth on behalf of the Crown.
Edward, as Prince of Wales, was a strange mixture of the very good and the very bad. He was very good in terms of giving good speeches, being charismatic, lighting up a party.
At a time when the tide of world prosperity in trade has receded, the participation of British manufacturers has surpassed all the estimates and expectations formulated in better times.
He's very bad because he had no actual investment in any of it. He often saw foreign trips as an opportunity simply to go and seduce local women.
It was just awfully nice, and before I met him, of course, I was scared to death. I didn't know what I was going to say to him, but he was so perfectly natural. Why, it just seemed like dancing with anybody else, and he talked and didn't talk about anything particular and a little bit of everything, and it was just loads of fun.
He had lots of relationships, and they all tended to be with married women, which of course drove his family mad and raised concerned eyebrows at court.
He embodied the persona of a handsome, charismatic prince and enjoyed the social and sexual spoils of his charmed existence, much to the chagrin of his father and then Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin. In the mid-1930s, Edward's sights and affections landed on Wallis Simpson, a once divorced and already married American woman. Both Palace and Parliament hoped that Edward's infatuation with Wallis would wane over time, as many of his other affairs had. However, the prince was determined to maintain his relationship with Miss Simpson.
Wallis Simpson came from a very well-bred American family. She absolutely adored her mother. She was an only child. She was a woman's woman. She adored her girlfriends and they adored her. So I would say she was principled, she was kind, she was loyal, she was bright, she was funny, and she was far more perspicacious than the man who was to become her husband.
Edward lavished her with jewels and with any kind of trinkets that she wanted, and there was a sense of it was never quite enough. Edward was utterly obsessed by Wallis Simpson. He was obsessed by her in a way that I think we'd look at today and see it as a form of stalking.
And of course she was intrigued by the Prince of Wales and incredibly flattered as she became involved in his milieu. But in her mind, this was just a sort of frisson, a flirtation, a bit of fun, and she was firmly married to her second husband, Ernest Simpson.
You look at accounts of how people saw the two of them together, and they said she's a clever woman, she's hard at nails, she doesn't love him, he's completely obsessed by her.
Events absolutely spiralled out of her control due to his inability to let her go or give her up.
The stress of the First World War had taken a toll on the king's health, and over a decade later, he fell seriously ill and never fully recovered. The king's health declined rapidly in the new year, and he took to his room on the 15th of January. He would not emerge from the room alive. King George V died at Sandringham on the 20th of January 1936 at age 70. Thus ended the 25-year reign of a king who had seen the country through the Great War and the discouraging peace which followed. King George V was well regarded by the public as he dealt skillfully and decisively with the successive crises in Ireland, the First World War, and the first socialist minority government. In a time of economic downturn, the assassination and deposition of many royal families around the world, and the threat of communism and fascism was growing. His death was met by the public with great sadness and loss.
Meanwhile, the likeness of the late king, draped in black, symbolizes Canada's solemnity and grief on this greatest day of mourning in the history of the world. From Parliament Hill to the last outpost of the Dominion's frontiers, flags are at half-mast. Millions throughout the empire listen to radio descriptions of the funeral, and for 2 minutes the flow of life is hushed. The Governor-General's residence is somber and still.
Following George V's death, he was immediately succeeded by eldest son Edward, Prince of Wales, who became Edward VIII.
God save the king!
Well, when his father died, he greeted his father's death with absolute hysteria, and he was throwing things around and shouting and unable to respond to it. And I think a lot of people thought this was a very bad omen of what was to come, and they were proved right.
While the procession made its way to George's lying in state at Westminster Hall, the cross surmounting the imperial state crown atop George's coffin fell off and landed in the gutter as the cortege turned a corner. The new king, Edward VIII, saw this and read it as an ill omen for his new reign.
He was enormously popular with the people. He was somebody who was seen as a completely different kind of king to every other, because he was seen as somebody who was very accessible.
Well, the tragedy of Edward VIII is actually he was incredibly popular as a king with his people.
Edward was very active, going out into villages, towns, cities, meeting, greeting ordinary working class people. There was a great deal of affection for him among the British public because he had this special intimate relationship with them.
The new king proved popular with his subjects, and his coronation was scheduled for May 1937. As feared by royal aides, Edward showed little interest in any sort of day-to-day governorship, and doubts emerged from both palace and parliament about his fitness for the role.
He wasn't a good king in the sense that he didn't have a great sense of responsibility. I mean, he used to drive his courtiers mad with the constant riposte, "Can I get away with it?" Which probably meant, can I get away with not fulfilling my duties?
The new king was mainly preoccupied with marrying Wallis Simpson, and from her husband at least, there was no resistance, as the American businessman agreed to let the king have his way.
Edward VIII saw kingship essentially as, first of all, a means of enriching himself, secondly, a means of maintaining his relationship with Wallis Simpson, and thirdly, arguably, as a means of furthering the Nazi cause within Britain.
It has been an ancient tradition of the British monarchy that the new sovereign should send a message to his people. Science has made it possible for me to make that written message more personal and to speak to you all over the radio. This, however, is no innovation, for my father has, for the last few years, spoken to his peoples at Christmas time. I feel that his death is not only an overwhelming grief to my mother and to us, his children, but that it is at the same time also a personal loss to you all. The vast crowds assembled reverently at the funeral, the homage to the late king's memory is a thing that we will never forget. It is no mere form of speech to say that he reigned in the hearts of his people. It now falls upon me to succeed him and to carry on his work. I am better known to most of you as the Prince of Wales, as a man who has had the opportunity of getting to know the people of nearly every country of the world. And although I now speak to you as the king, I am still that same man whose constant effort it will be to continue to promote the well-being of his fellow men. May the future bring peace and understanding throughout the world, prosperity and happiness to British people, and may we be worthy of the heritage which is ours.
His affair with Miss Simpson was reported by the press in America and continental Europe, but was kept out of the British newspapers due to a gentleman's agreement between the British press and the government.
The great press barons, Lord Beaverbrook and Lord Rothermere, had conspired together to basically say to other Fleet Street editors of newspapers that they mustn't publish the story about Wallis and Edward, that this must be kept a closely guarded secret.
Well, in the upper classes in Britain in the early 1930s, it was considered rather fashionable to keep a mistress. And so the fact that Edward, as the greatest man of fashion of them all, was involved with a married woman was in no sense remarkable. What surprised people was, first of all, that she was American, which was seen as vulgar. Secondly, that she didn't come from a grand family, but was the daughter of a Baltimore boarding house proprietor. And thirdly, the fact that he seemed to be completely and utterly besotted by her.
I think that British spies were monitoring Edward and Wallis because the court was so desperately worried about the influence of this American woman on Edward, and there was still this feeding frenzy of rumour and innuendo and gossip.
Even before Edward became king, there was a general sense that he was a security risk.
Edward was seen as a dangerous man to have as king. He wanted reformation and was seen by Parliament as ungovernable. Additionally, there is some controversy surrounding Edward's political beliefs.
Both Edward and Wallis maintained close friendships with foreign government representatives, most notably Joachim von Ribbentrop of the Nazi state.
At a time of great international unrest, the last thing that Britain needed was a king whose personal and indeed political motives were seen as suspect. And so Edward was being watched.
The close relationship with the Nazis raised questions over whether Edward and Wallis were themselves possessed of fascist sympathies.
It was said by Tommy Lascelles before Edward became king that I hope that he would fall off his horse while racing and break his neck. And Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, said, "God help me, so do I." Nobody wanted him to become king because they saw him as a complete liability, but also, and I think this is crucial, somebody who could not be governed. Because up to that point, and I suppose subsequently as well, there has always been the tacit understanding that the king governs by consent. The king is a constitutional monarch who rules within the boundaries set down by the British Constitution. He does what he's told, in other words. Edward had no interest in doing what he was told. He wanted to be a reforming monarch. He wanted to be somebody who was going to tear up the certainties that his father and grandfather and great-grandmother had governed by. And because of this, he was seen as somebody who was incredibly dangerous. But of course, what do you do with a troublesome king? You can't just kill them, after all.
The church and the palace did not think that Edward was going to be a good king and wanted somehow to remove him from the throne. When Mrs. Simpson came along, their prayers were answered because suddenly here was somebody who could take the blame for the fact that, as I say, the unholy trinity of palace, parliament and church did not want Edward VIII on the throne.
Some recent biographers have claimed that the king was pushed by the government to abdicate, not because of his relationship with Mrs. Simpson, rather his extreme political beliefs and association with fascist sympathisers in a time of growing political crisis. Around the time Wallis Simpson was granted a preliminary divorce from her husband in October 1936, Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin finally confronted Edward about the severity of the situation.
Is a great idea.
The Church of England would not marry a divorcee with a living ex-husband, let alone two. Over the course of several tense meetings, Baldwin expressed his belief that the Edward-Wallis marriage would not be supported by the government or the British people, and explained why Parliament, as representative of the people, could determine who was suitable to be Queen. Edward then proposed a morganatic marriage, in which Wallis would not receive a royal title, but this was rejected. So too was Edward's request to make his case to his subjects by way of a radio address. Ultimately, the king was faced with two options: end his relationship with Miss Simpson and remain king, or abdicate the throne to marry the woman he loved.
Edward always knew that abdication was a possibility. If we go and look at the diaries of his friends and associates earlier on in 1936, when they're talking about the affair before it's become public news, we know that Edward was already considering this idea that he might have to abdicate in order to marry the woman he loved.
You can't simply unilaterally abdicate. It isn't as easy as just saying, I don't want to be king anymore, and stopping being king. It's a whole responsibility, not just to yourself, but to the nation. And so while I think he would have given up being king immediately, it wasn't in his power.
There was definitely pressure for him to abdicate from Stanley Baldwin. I mean, Stanley Baldwin saw this as an event to rejoice over. The greatest myth about Wallis Simpson is that it's been convenient for history to paint her as the wicked witch in this and the woman that pushed for abdication. That is the biggest lie.
Wallis did not want Edward to abdicate for the very simple reason that Wallis was terrified of what was going to happen to her.
it was essentially going to be her or the crown. He couldn't have both. And so she tried to escape press attention. She fled to the south of France, and there she actually released a public statement where she said, "I want him to stay on the throne. If it comes down to it, he should choose the British people and his throne ahead of me."
Just prior to the abdication, one of his courtiers said he was exalted to the point of madness, and at this point was sleeping with a loaded pistol under his pillow. And he literally emotionally blackmailed Wallace and said, "If you leave me, I shall kill myself." And there was a really real possibility of that. He was so unhinged at this stage. And she just couldn't risk that. So she could not escape. But for anyone to say that Wallis Simpson wanted to be queen, that she wanted Edward to abdicate, is an utter falsehood.
There was a genuine fear in December 1936 that Edward could have brought down the entire monarchy with him, because there were rumours at one point he was just going to flee the country with Wallis, and that be that.
The royal visitor, His Majesty King Edward VIII. Britain's ruler arrives at the Clyde shipyards after an enthusiastic reception in Glasgow.
The major news story of the day, that the King of England was involved in a relationship with a married American woman, was just simply not talked about. It was all over the papers in America, it was all over the papers in Europe, and in Britain it simply was not mentioned at all. And so the editors and proprietors were faced with this tension between, do we keep the story off the papers like we're supposed to, or do we run it, and do we sell papers that way? And all of them were waiting essentially for a sign. And the sign came on the 1st of December 1936 when Bishop Walter Blunt, the Bishop of Bradford, preached a sermon.
The Bishop of Bradford stood up on a Sunday morning and criticised the king for behaving in an unchristian way.
The sermon by the Bishop of Bradford was so cataclysmic in the whole run-up to the abdication because it was the first time that the royal family were really tainted by scandal.
And this sermon has been seen as very ambiguous because some people have said that the sermon was essentially his attacking the king for his relationship with Wallis Simpson and attacking the king for not being able to be the head of the Church of England.
What he actually was talking about was the fact that Edward didn't go to church very much on Sundays. But what the London newspapers interpreted this comment as was an implicit criticism of Edward's affair with Wallis.
And it was this sermon that really broke the dam on the press moratorium. And the editor of the Times said, "I can't possibly remain silent."
The next day, the scandal broke on the front pages of British newspapers.
I mean, for the public, his abdication was a rejection.
When it became clear that Edward was thinking about abdicating the throne in order to marry Wallis Simpson, there was an enormously mixed reaction. You could essentially summarise it like this. The middle classes were horrified and disgusted because they saw the king having this relationship with a married woman, indeed a divorced woman, something that was completely unacceptable.
Quite apart from the fact that she isn't of noble blood, Mrs. Simpson has twice been in the divorce courts. To my mind, that completely rules her out as Queen of England.
I'm a chauffeur by profession. After all, the king is a man like myself, but he should not allow his private life to interfere with his public life.
For many members of the British public, especially the British working classes who really had loved Edward, this was a moment of shock and horror.
My opinion of the king, he should marry who he loves. He's been a good chap to the working class. That's my opinion of him.
Personally, I think he is a sign of modern democratic times. I do not think that the church should interfere in matters of state.
The nation is behind him, and we must not lose him.
With no path for compromise, Edward informed Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin on December the 5th that he would abdicate. On December the 10th, a bill was introduced in the House of Commons, and 2 days later, the Declaration of Abdication Act went into effect, formally freeing Edward of his kingship. The following day, King Edward VIII of the United Kingdom addressed his subjects via a radio announcement. One night in December, families huddled around their radios to hear the shocking news. Their king was to leave them.
His Royal Highness Prince Edward.
At long last, I am able to say a few words of my own. I have never wanted to withhold anything, but until now, it has not been constitutionally possible for me to speak. But you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love. And now we all have the new king. I wish him and you, his people, happiness and prosperity with all my heart. God bless you all. God save the king.
A few hours after the address, Edward left the country, ending a turbulent 325-day reign that brought the British monarchy to a near collapse. Although a constitutional crisis was avoided and the ex-king was now free to marry as he wanted, the ordeal cast a long shadow over the monarchy and the reign of his brother King George VI for years to come.
The wedding day was a bittersweet affair. She had become the most hated woman in the world. It really was them against the world. I'm not sure that if he'd been told, this is what's going to happen to your wife, you will be exiled from the country, you will never really see your family again, would he still have done it?
The couple spent the majority of their remaining years in France in a quasi-exile, forever at odds with the British royal family. One night in December, the king's younger brother Bertie sobbed onto his mother's shoulder, the heavy burden of the crown soon to be his to bear. The withdrawn man, desperate not to be king,
George VI was desperate not to become king. He was absolutely terrified by responsibilities of what would happen.
I mean, there's no way that George can have been prepared for his role to be king. It would just never have occurred to him.
This was a moment of great challenge for him, in that he was something of a reluctant figure. He had been up until this point a family man. He enjoyed his private home life away from the media, away from the cameras. He knew from this point forward that this would all become and be put on public show.
The shock for the royal family when Edward abdicated, and the shock for Bertie, was something that he possibly never got over.
Thrust into power in a time of crisis upon his brother's abdication, Prince Albert, who chose the name King George VI, became the first monarch to succeed to the throne while his predecessor was still alive. This would prove to be a problem throughout the new king's reign, as he sought to gain his public's favour and step out of the shadow of his brother, who had been immensely popular with the people.
The public didn't really want George VI as king because they were largely enamoured of his brother, and because he wasn't seen as a charismatic or stylish figure, they were disappointed by him.
Loath to see their fashionable and popular King Edward replaced, the public were not impressed with the quiet and stammering King George VI.
After he left, there was a great sense of disappointment, and a cloud hanged heavy over the British monarchy. And actually, George VI, the new king, he was really overshadowed by his brother, now titled the Duke of Windsor, through the early years of his reign. He had to do much to win back the loyalty and affection of the greater British public. "1936 was the year of three kings. It was a year that greatly unsettled the British monarchy.
It's extraordinary when you think about it that 1 year saw three kings of England, George V, Edward VIII and George VI. But I think what's very interesting also is they were completely different kinds of people. George V was the last of the Victorians. He was this stern, unbending, old-fashioned ruler. Edward VIII was the first modern monarch. He's somebody who probably bears more relation to the monarchy today than he did to his own time. He was somebody who prized personal happiness, personal fulfilment, and what he wanted to do over any concept of duty, any concept of conventional kingship. Then George VI is something else altogether. He was somebody who was completely ill-equipped for the job, which he never thought he'd have to do. He was somebody who was terrified by the responsibilities that came along with it. But what he had, which served him exceptionally well later, was first of all his father's sense of duty and his father's sense of the monarchy as something sacred. But he also had the ability to listen to people, which his brother never did. And that was what was so crucial.
One night in 1936, as the clock struck 12, announcing the arrival of a new year, the new king stared blankly into the flames of his fireplace. Perhaps he thought of the Crystal Palace engulfed by flames and saw it as a warning, an echo of the chaos wrought by his brother and how close the monarchy had come to total collapse. The abdication crisis had called into question the role and relevance of the monarchy in a world in the midst of change. The country had been witness to a dead king, an ex-king, and a new king, all in the span of 12 short months. King George would have to toil to win over the affections and allegiances of his people. A great deal of uncertainty lay on the horizon. 1936 was an alarming prologue of a budding political and economic crisis and mounting tensions that would lead the whole world to war. And the new King George VI would have to rule, unyielding, throughout it.